Yeah, so maybe why don't we start with the fact this report had no dissenting opinions. I believe unanimously passed. Why was that Arctic security the issue that brought you together? Why was that important for you as conservative members of this committee to make that clear?
Well, we support the conclusions of the report and its recommendations. You know, at this time when Canada's sovereignty is under threat, it's important that we work together to protect our sovereignty. We support the government's recent announcements to increase investments in the North and in the Arctic, something that Conservatives have long called for.
Yeah, and you mentioned part of that is welcoming the government's $35 billion Arctic plan, but it stresses the report, I want to read it, the committee must be, these investments must be insulated from political shifts. We've heard big Arctic promises before. Yeah. How do we ensure that these are followed through on?
Well, one of the things we would like to see from the government is greater clarity on exactly how the money is being spent and when it's being spent. Minister Anand made a big announcement on the Arctic using one set of figures a couple of years ago, using on an accrual accounting basis. The Prime Minister more recently made a parallel announcement using cash accounting. And so it's hard for us to reconcile those two figures. And so, you know, our view is that the government needs to provide much greater clarity on exactly how the money is being spent and when it's going to be spent. So that's one thing we're looking for from the government that wasn't included in the report.
A large part of this is procurement, moving timelines along faster on things like the F-45s. This report also mentions a submarine fleet in the Arctic. This, I don't know, to an outside, this is decades to come. This isn't something that's going to happen in a few years or even a decade. How does the committee see any of this actually becoming a reality?
Well, as we're concerned about the government's military procurement, the Auditor General last year indicated that Canada's acquisition of the F-35 jets was not only 50% over budget, but also years behind schedule. And that doesn't have to be that way. The government needs to do a better job of procuring fighter jets. Finland and Canada made the decision to purchase new fighter jets around the same time in 2022. Finland, a country of about 5 million people, decided to purchase some 65 F-35 jets. Canada, a country of 40 million people, decided to purchase roughly 88 of these fighter jets. And Finland's fighter jets will be fully operational, including all the pilot training and bases up and running, including in their Arctic region, by 2030. The Auditor General has said that at the earliest, Canada's program of training pilots and upgrading bases would be ready in 2034. And so we're behind schedule here. The government needs to do a much better job of military procurement, particularly with these fighter jets, which would be so important for the Arctic region.
A couple of the recommendations also deal with permanent presence of the Canadian Army and of the Canadian intelligence in the region. I guess it's a two-parter for me. I think Canadians would be surprised that we don't have permanent presence in the Arctic at this point. Why is it taking this long, and why is it so important for both intelligence and an armed forces base to be part of this?
Yeah, unlike countries like Finland or Norway, part of the NATO alliance, we don't have a permanent full-time military base in the Arctic region. And that's something that we argued for some time now, and something that the committee has adopted in its report. The government, in our view, is proposing to upgrade forward operating locations, but they've not proposed a permanent new base, something that we've not had since the end of the Cold War. Russia has dozens of military bases in their Arctic region. As I mentioned earlier, Finland and Norway have military bases. So we support the recommendation in the report that the government build a permanent new military base in the Arctic region in order to project and protect Canada's sovereignty.
Can you touch on CSIS a little bit there as well? Because it also recommends a CSIS base. Why is that?
Yeah, as CSIS Director Dan Rogers has highlighted recently, one of the two threat actors in the Arctic region are Russia and China. And they are threatening our sovereignty in the region, both above water and underwater. CSIS pointed out in its testimony during committee that it does not have a permanent presence in the Arctic region, and we think it's important that that presence be established. I think in general, the point of the report and what we as Conservatives have long argued for is that Canada needs to build more infrastructure in the north, and we need a more of a permanent presence in the north. If you compare, for example, Scandinavian countries in their Arctic regions, they have much more infrastructure than we do. For example, they have a network of highways that connects their southern regions to their Arctic regions. They have permanent military bases. They have other types of infrastructure and government and military presence in their regions than we do. So the Arctic in Canada is 40% of our landmass. It's a vast region that we need to protect, and the Government of Canada needs to ensure that we have sufficient projection and protection of sovereignty in that region.
And I guess finally, the report also makes clear cooperation and involvement with Indigenous and Inuit communities in the region is key to making any of this possible, and if not utmost important. They have the knowledge of the land, and they're by far the people who will be affected the most by this. The report also makes clear that this hasn't been done in things like creating the dew line and stuff like that. If we've seen before that Indigenous populations have been, for lack of a better word, ignored in some of these projects before, how can we be assured that they'll be involved in moving forward here?
Well, the report speaks to the need to include Indigenous peoples, Inuit peoples in the north. In particular, I think there's two parts of the report that speak to that. The first is the report's recommendation that the government continue to invest to expand the Arctic Rangers program, which is made up of Indigenous peoples who are the on-the-ground eyes and ears that help the Government of Canada and our military and intelligence authorities have a physical presence in the north. The other part of the report that I think is critically important is the parts of the report that touch on infrastructure. You know, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lack of basic infrastructure in the north, a lack of a highway system to connect connect remote Arctic communities. And so that's the reason why people in the north often struggle, why the cost of food and basic essentials is so high, because they're not connected through a network of roads and other infrastructure to the south that allows them to efficiently get these goods and services in the Arctic and northern regions. So the report is recommending that the government accelerate its investments in infrastructure in the north, and that's a real tangible way to help Indigenous communities there.
And sorry, actually, the final one, NORAD modernization is also a key figure here. Times like this, modernizing NORAD means dealing with the White House, President Trump. How do you think building Arctic security with a partner who may not share our interests, especially at this point, and we have them at least for a few more years, how is that possible?
Well, at minimum, we can invest in our own Arctic region to defend our own sovereignty and security. And so that's, I think, something we can proceed with regardless of whether or not the White House or the U.S. administration is supportive of that. This is our territory. This is our sovereignty. As I mentioned earlier, 40% of Canada's landmass is in the Arctic region. We have a responsibility ourselves to take control of this area and ensure that Canadian sovereignty is protected.
Anything we missed? Anything like that?
Nope, I think that's it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, guys. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Well, good afternoon. Wanted to talk today about the Prime Minister announcement of an investment summit that he's saying is going to take place in Toronto to try and actually generate some investment in Canada. Now, it's very interesting to choose an investment summit when we know what the impediments are to actually getting investment in Canada. We know that the Liberals' past decade of anti-development legislation like Bill C-69, the tanker ban, the industrial carbon tax, all of these things have made investment in Canada dry up. So rather than actually choose to address the issues that are causing the lack of investment in Canada, The Prime Minister's plan is, I'm going to send out a bunch of invitations, tell people to come to Toronto and try and convince them to invest in Canada. There's, of course, a much better plan to do that, which is to change the fundamental issues that are driving investment out of Canada. In fact, the CEO of Enbridge said heavy regulation and uncertainty and delays in getting projects approved are the reason why they are not investing in Canada. And we would urge the Prime Minister, rather than having this investment summit, to look at the fundamental issues that are driving investment out of Canada and make those changes.
And just to add, we saw the report from RBC that confirmed that over the last 10 years, we have seen about $1 trillion of investment leave our country. And so these investments have left because of the fundamental issues that have not been addressed, being slow permitting. We are the second slowest country in the OECD to issue these permits, high cost, over taxation, over regulation, and a number of the bills that the Liberals put in place that prevent investment. To add to that, we have confirmation from the CFIB that there are 6 consecutive quarters in Canada where more businesses have shut down than opened up. So these are Canadian investors, Canadian business owners, Canadian entrepreneurs that have had to close their doors because it's just so difficult to do business here in Canada. And while the Prime Minister may try to go abroad and try to attract investment from abroad, the reality is he's ignoring domestic dollars, domestic entrepreneurs that are trying to keep their businesses open, making personal sacrifices to keep their businesses open, and they're not being able to do that. There is a prime example in my riding of a business owner who was trying to expand his business here, trying to get a permit, did not get a response, was able to go to Ohio, get his permits, get his funding, and walk across the street and get his financing, and flew home, and there was still no update on the permitting here in Canada. Those are the fundamental issues that drive investment. Any rational investor from around the world will look at those details and have to make a decision as to where they want to invest their dollars, where they're going to get their highest return in the shortest time frame. And the reality is, the investors that may come here for this summit are also going around the world, and we're going to be challenged because the Prime Minister is not focusing on domestic issues.
Okay. Thank you very much.